All right, welcome to Start Writing. I'm Joe Bendosky, and today I have an interview with a certified story grid editor. This is Lori Puma, and so we will talk about the story grid in general for those of you who are not familiar, and what makes it different as far as its approach to writing a story and editing a story. So we are still sticking with the one episode a month, but this was an interview we had scheduled beforehand. And so we're still going to be releasing it. There'll be 2 episodes again in July, as we do have one more interview scheduled. But after that, it will actually go down to 1 a month, unless, of course, I keep getting contacted by people. But like I said, I am no longer actively seeking out interviews, as we're trying to cut back and focus on just getting more writing done. And so here is the interview with Lori. I'm Joe Bendosky, and this is the Start Writing Podcast. And today, my guest is Lori Puma, and she is a certified story grid editor. Lori, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. So my name is Lori Puma, and I help writers craft page-turning stories and build the storytelling skills that they need to have a very long career in fiction. So that means helping them with scenes that really grab readers' attention and writing overall books that readers just can't put down.
Okay. So first of all, you're an editor, and so talk to me about the choice to become an editor as opposed to a writer, or even both, because it seems like you're kind of all in on the editing aspect.
I am totally all in on the editing aspect. Yes, there are some writers who also edit, but I am definitely an editor who also sometimes writes. And really for me, it was really realizing that I had actually been editing for a long time, even though I wasn't calling myself an editor. And I just really love working with writers and working with all kinds of people on their stories. And there are just these wonderful moments where they realize that they do have something to share with people, and they get so excited. And I just love that. And I could help people with stories all day long, every day, and be happy for the rest of my life.
Okay, so I guess why the editing as opposed to really pushing your own writing career there? Why that side of the coin?
You know, it's really sort of like I really enjoy the teaching aspect of that, just like that moment, those moments when the light bulbs go on, when people that are like a lot of times when writers come to me, they're like, well, I've had this dream of becoming a writer. I don't know if it's ever going to happen. I'm not sure if it's even something I should pursue anymore because it doesn't seem like I'm getting anywhere. And then in the course of working with me, they start getting really excited because they're like, oh my gosh, I can do this. Like this is possible. And it's super fun.
Okay. So, and then you said you are a certified story grid editor. Tell me what that means.
Yeah, so the story grid is a method of editing which was created by Sean Coyne. He is an editor with over 25 years of experience. He's worked at traditional publishers, he's had his own publishing company, he's worked as a literary agent, and really what he did over that course of time is develop a method for taking manuscripts that came across his desk and really turning them into the sort of stories that had potential as to sell a lot of books.
Okay, so that's what the story grid is. What does this mean to be a certified story grid editor?
Yes, so it means that I have been trained by Sean himself, with an assist from Tim Grahl, who he does the podcast, the Story Grid podcast with, and I've learned the stuff about genre and life value shifts that we're going to talk about today. And there's just really a comprehensive system that he's developed. So if you know anything about the story grid, you might know that there's a spreadsheet involved. And so I know how to create those spreadsheets. I know about all of the thinking that goes into creating a story that really grabs readers and keeps their attention.
So, okay, so I understand, like, Sean training you. He created the story grid. He wrote the book. You know, this is very much his system. What was Tim's role in your training?
Yeah, Tim really helped us with some of the business aspects of it. So, like, a lot of the people that were coming to the training, you know, like, I had actually been working with coaches on their marketing, and while I was editing their personal stories, I was not editing fiction at that time. So Tim was sort of helping us, like, here are things that you can do to transition into doing, you know, working with writers specifically. So that was his.
Oh, okay. So his role was about working with fiction writers and different things like that. Okay.
Yeah, and then
That
he's
makes
really,
that makes more sense. I was like,
yeah.
what is Tim doing there? He's learning this like the rest of us. Okay, that makes more sense to me. So, okay, so as we've been emailing back and forth, we decided we were going to kind of talk about scenes and master scenes and different things like this. But you had mentioned that the story grid, one of the things that really makes it unique is that it's this very integrated platform. So before we dive into anything specific, why don't you give us kind of that general overview to give us that context to really understand the story grid formula before we dive into anything too deep.
Yeah, so the way that I like to explain it for writers is that, so story grid is basically a really comprehensive set of all of the stuff that readers expect from your story, but they absolutely cannot tell you.
Right.
And some of it has to do with genre, and some of it has to do with, like, how you put together individual scenes. And really what differentiates the story grid, well, the reason that I chose to get certified in the story grid and not, like, Save the Cat or some other,
Is there certification for Save the Cat?
There definitely are gurus for Save the Cat. I don't remember if they have, like, a
training.
Yeah, like a set training that you can do, but I think that they do. But the reason that I was like, I am 100% in on the story grid is that I just recognized that the way that he talked about how everything was related is really what separates it out, because it's kind of like writing a novel is really like solving a complex Sudoku puzzle, except nobody gives you the grid to fill in.
Right. Well, and I think there's like and you know, just based on listening to Sean and his conversations with Tim, I think there's a little more fluidity with story grid, as it is more about understanding those connections, where Save the Cat is more just like a rigid outline you follow.
Yeah, I could see how you could take that away from that. It's definitely not as in depth.
Yeah, well, and I mean, because Save the Cat was written for screenwriters, and I did screenwriting for years, and like there are page numbers for incidents. Like,
yes,
the inciting incident will happen on page 17, right? Like that's Save the Cat for you right there.
Yes, yeah, story grid is not as prescriptive. Like, a lot of people think that story grid is like, well, it's giving you a formula, so you shouldn't do that. And I'm just like, no, he's telling you, like, this is the world that you need to play within. And if you go beyond these ranges, you're in territory that we're not sure exactly how it works. Right. And so, like, that's different.
Yeah, you go avant-garde, which may or may not work.
Exactly.
So, okay. All right. So, do we need to discuss any more of the context here? Are you ready to start giving us some examples and diving a little deeper?
Yeah. So the place to start with story grid is always with genre. And the reason that we start there is because story grid is very specific about what it means about genre. And it's not always the way that writers, it's not always exactly the concept that writers already have in their head about what genre is. Mm-hmm. So story grid splits genres into 5 different types. There's a little 5-leaf clover, and I'm going to give you the names of all 5, but we're only really going to focus on one of them. So the names of those are time, structure, reality, style, and content.
So you're calling these the genres?
So those are the types of genres.
Okay.
And so the one that we need to talk about, because it tells you the most about your story, is the content genre.
Okay.
Or the content genres. So what are content genres? So those are things like action, crime, horror, love, morality, performance, status, society, thriller, war, Western, and worldview. Those are actually all that Sean has listed.
Okay.
And so the reason that we talk about those is that those, if you know that you are writing an action story, you know that your narrative arc for your character from beginning to end of the story is going to be about, will the hero defeat the villain? Yes or no? No. If you are writing a crime story, you know that the narrative arc of your entire plot is, will the criminal get away with the crime? So each of these 12 content genres has a specific question that is the question that your story must answer.
Mm-hmm.
It can do other things, like, for example, Guardians of the Galaxy is one of my personal favorite action stories. And so, like, so one, we want to know, is Peter Quill going to save the galaxy? Yes or no? But, like, there's also a love story, but it's secondary. And yeah, so the thing that we want to take away from this content genre is it tells you what type of story you are going to tell at a very, like, 10,000 feet level.
Right.
And not only do you know, like, what single question, you know a lot about how your story needs to be organized when you know what that one question is.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Well, and I think a lot of writers, particularly if they're writing their first or second novel, that's a big issue because they have an idea of what a chase scene is going to look like. They've seen movies, they've read books, but the comprehension of the whole overall arc of a story is beyond them, right? Like, I remember when I was first studying writing, reading about narrative arc, I'm like, what is it? What are they even talking about? Narrative arc. And it's those stepping stones that are building to answering that single question posed by these content genres.
Yeah. So I'd love to give you an example of what, like, so I work with writers that have first drafts, and then I help them figure out, like, what the heck is going on and get to the second draft. And so, like, I had a writer come to me that had written over 100,000 words, and she thought she was about maybe like 35% of the way into her story.
At 100,000 words?
At 100,000 words.
I mean, that's Sanderson, but, there's few authors who do that.
Yes, yeah. And she was like, I know it's too much. I know that I need to cut. I don't know what to do. And so I went and I read her, her 120,000 words, and I was like, okay, so we've got elements of a mystery, of a crime story here that, so there's like this, will the hero hold the villain accountable thing. There were elements of a love story in there, and there were elements of a thriller. And I also ask my writers a lot of questions about, like, what do you really want to do with this story? And, like, this writer really wanted to say something about, like, truth and how, sometimes, like, organized religion lets us down. And she wanted there to be a villain, and it was also paranormal. And I was like, okay. So taking all of those things together, it was really pretty easy to figure out that what she really wanted to do is write a thriller. So then we could get rid of, like, the love story subplot. We could get rid of the mystery, the pieces of the mystery that didn't serve the thriller, we didn't need those anymore.
Right. Okay. So I guess so that was it. You just had her cut all these plot lines. And how many words was she at then?
Yeah, so for her particular story, we actually kind of started over because then there were so once we got clear on like what was going on, then we were like, okay, we know that we're doing a thriller. A thriller always starts with some sort of inciting crime/attack. What does that need to be now? Because previously her story had started with a mystery that we were now like, well, this maybe isn't the best place to start. So
yeah. So did you crush her spirit when you said start over?
I don't ever say start over. But she was actually so relieved that I was giving her direction that I'm sure that she knew. Most writers know when they come to me, they're like, I know that I need to do something different. I just have no clue what that should be. Yeah. So if you could tell me what that is.
That's funny. Okay. So are we ready to dive into scene, or do you want to give us another example?
Yeah, well, I can actually just extend this example. So, okay, so we took away all of these elements, from the overall story and got clear, okay, we're telling a thriller. Now we need to start the thriller with a really strong scene. How do we do that? Because we know that this scene needs to do a couple of things. Like, it's opening the book, so we have to meet the hero. It's a thriller, so there has to be a hero and a victim and a villain. And this particular book also has a paranormal element. So we wanted to do something that indicates like, this isn't like reality. This is more in the fantasy horror thing or realm of story. So we wanted to make sure that we established that. So
yes. Oh my gosh. I just on this point, this is something we've talked about on the podcast before. Have you ever read or heard of the book I Am Not a Serial Killer?
I have not heard of that one. No, tell me about it.
Okay, so it's this is a book. Oh, what's his name? Dan Wells writes this book. They actually made a movie out of it recently. And the book is about a teenager who has all of the markers of becoming a serial killer. And he's obsessed with serial killers. He studies them all the time. And he even fights his own urges not to kind of follow this trend in his life. And so the opening of the book is all about this teenager trying not to become a serial killer, where it feels like everything in his life is kind of pushing him that way. And then, like, I don't know, a third of the way into the book, a demon shows up. And it's just like, whoa, what? What? And anyone who has read this book will tell you that was probably the most frustrating part for them. And even like I've even heard Dan talk about like his writing group was always like, you have got to get this concept in sooner. It's too big a shock when this comes up. Because when you read the demon part, it feels like you've switched genres and stories. I started out reading a story about it's a unique coming of age story for a kid who was a very unique psychological issues and perspective on life, and it was fascinating. And then suddenly I was reading a horror story with demons in the paranormal world. And like a lot of people have a hard time with the story at that point.
Yes, so this is the exact problem that the story grid helps you avoid. Because some readers do, there will always be like 10% maybe of people that are like, this was brilliant, because they're very unique and special snowflakes. But the vast majority of readers tend to get really pissed off when they pick up a book and think that it is going to be one thing, and then halfway through you change it into something that is not at all what you promised them at the beginning.
Yes, yeah. We've even talked about that on the podcast. I don't know if you heard our episode. We talk about the author's promise, and that if you make a promise in the beginning of the book and then change it to surprise the reader, what you end up doing is not delivering on your promise.
Yes. Yeah, so a lot of what I work on with writers is how to be surprising without breaking those promises to reader. So like
Yeah.
going
Do you have an example on that?
Yeah, so I'm actually just going to pick up with the story that we've been talking about. So my writer with the paranormal thriller. So what I had her do was, so we talked about like, okay, what does your opening scene need to be? We're like, we know we need to know who the hero is, who is going to get killed, and there needs to be somebody that represents the villain. They don't have to be the villain that is the ultimate villain at the end, but somebody has to be the force of evil. And so I just sent her away and I was like, brainstorm a list of 10 different ideas on how you can do that. Brainstorm, you can change the setting, you can change the person. And this writer had already written 120,000 words. So she had like character. I'm like, imagine if this character is the victim. Imagine if that character is the victim. Like, what are the situations that you're going to get in that opening? Because in her case, we knew that somebody was going to die. And so what are the circumstances of that death? And so she just, she brainstormed a list and she came up with this, oh my gosh, super twisted and really, really brutal attack that is so riveting. So it's like the protagonist of this story is mentally has been in a mental asylum, and like her psychiatrist gets murdered by one of maybe his colleagues or something, and it's a paranormal. There's a paranormal thing going on, and I'm totally not doing it justice. But she actually published it, and she published it on her Patreon page. So if somebody wants to read it, they totally can, because it's pretty compelling.
All right. So you told her you need to have elements of the paranormal in the first chapter so that the readers are ready for that.
Yeah, so the things that so basically what the story grid says is a lot of the stuff about genre is we already know it. So we know how thrillers start. We know that thrillers have a convention that there's always a hero, victim, and villain, and at every point in your story, there you can identify someone who is playing that role. Those roles can shift, but that's always going to be there. We also know in a thriller that the overall story is going to shift from, somebody being it's going to shift along a life and death is what's going to be at stake in this story. And it's really like about good overcoming evil.
So talk to me about the role of the victim in talking about genres and reading about genres. This is the first time I've heard this role mentioned. Can you talk to me a little more in depth about it?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So there are a couple of genres that have hero, victim, and villain. So thriller definitely does. I actually think that action, horror, Western, and thriller, I think, are the four that have them. And so the hero's role is to save the victim. And so in a story like Guardians of the Galaxy, at first, Peter Quill is both the hero and the victim. Everyone is trying to kill him in the opening, in the opening the opening sequences of the movie is like everybody is out to get him. But then when they discover what the orb really does, then it shifts to being something like at the end of this movie, which I'm totally going to spoil if you haven't seen it. But if you haven't seen it, this is your opportunity to go watch it. At the end of it, it's like the entire galaxy, right?
Okay.
He's saving everybody. So like the victim, there always has to be a victim or somebody that is potential. Like you can't have a villain unless the villain is threatening to do something to a bunch of people or to at least a single person.
Right.
And over the course of the story, you either go from having a single victim in the beginning to having everybody in the universe be a victim. So it's
Okay.
either more or it becomes more personal.
Right.
So
Okay, so this victim thing is making a lot of sense to me. Tell me about a scene that doesn't have a victim role in it and is not a romance scene. Because I mean, I can see that in a romance scene, right? There's not a victim; they're in conflict for one reason or another. But so, is there, or is there such a scene, or are all scenes without
are
victim
you
roles
asking
romance?
like within action and thriller?
Just any example, you know.
Okay,
So if we take romance off the table, is there a type of scene where we're not going to have a victim role?
yes, yeah. So there's actually a bunch of stories where you don't have victims. So like performance stories don't really have victims. So performance stories are every sports movie that you've ever seen,
Okay.
every dance movie, you know, Rocky, Rudy. Oh gosh, I'm trying to think of one that I know well enough. So so we talked about the content genres, and each of the content genres also, once you know the content genre, you know what the climax of your story is going to be. So the climax in a performance story is some sort of big event. So like in Florence Foster Jenkins, it's that terrible performance at Carnegie Hall. In Rocky, it's the big fight. In oh gosh, in my personal favorite dance movie, Strictly Ballroom, it's this like Pan-Pacific Grand Prix championships.
Right. Yeah. So some kind of championship event thing.
Yeah, like I'm pretty sure there's like an ice skating movie, maybe The Cutting Edge, where it's like the Olympics or, you know,
Yeah.
the national championships. It's always something like that. And so then it's really not about will the hero save the person. It's really about will the hero like be able to, you know, overcome their issues and really perform at the level of their potential.
Yeah. Okay, so that makes sense. Yeah. So I can definitely see those kind of stories out there as well. Okay. All right. So I feel like we kind of got off track. Let's go back to the opening scene of this thriller.
Yes.
We have a victim, we have paranormal components, and now what?
Yeah, and so the other thing that we really thought about is like, so we know that at one point in the opening sequence, somebody is going to die, but how can we really make that surprising? And the way that we thought about how to do that is we thought about like what's called life value shifts. So we might need to take a small tangent in order to have this part of the conversation. But really, we're like, what's going to make this, you know, what's the relationship that we want the protagonist to have to the victim? And how can we show that through action?
Okay.
So, like, for this story, we talked about, so this was a patient-doctor relationship. Well, we have expectations about, you know, this doctor is going to be this person that is, you know, like respected by the local society, because that's our stereotype of doctors, is that they're these, you know, very well-to-do, very eloquent, very, you know, just the kinds of people that we want to be. And what this author ended up doing with her story is she made her psychiatrist an adulterer. And that's why the villain was after him, was because he had been, the villain was like, this is not, you know, the villain really wants like people to be pure in some way. And so she came up with like, well, what are all of the ways that, you know, people can be impure? And so that's something that, you know, plays against type. And then we also, her protagonist is also working as a newspaper. So she had so she came up with lots of ideas, but the one that she eventually took was, you know, well, what if the newspaper is going to publish a story talking about all the sordid details about this doctor, and then what gets the protagonist involved is this is somebody that really, you know, contributed to her life, and she wants to protect him. And so she goes and she tries to warn him, which, you know, it gives her motivation. It's not something that you expect. Like, that's not a cliche. So those are the kinds of things to think about when you're like, okay, I know I need to write a scene that does this. How can I make that more interesting?
Okay. All right. So in talking about the story grid in general, so we've talked about this specific scene, and you said it's a lot about the different relationships and whatnot. So how does writing this scene connect to the other relationships or whatever in the book?
Yeah, so this scene really sets up like a lot of the motivations for the rest of the book. So it turned out that the doctor in this story had written about the protagonist and her mental issues in the book. And what the villain wants from the doctor is he wants to know about, like, you know, somebody listed as like patient number 4 in the book. And so through the scenes, the protagonist finds out that actually they're looking for her. So now we know that we've got a thriller, because these people that just killed a doctor are looking for the protagonist.
Yeah, that sounds like a thriller.
Right?
So, okay, so then talk to me about the whole spreadsheet. You mentioned that there's a spreadsheet that goes along with the story grid. What is this spreadsheet, and what is it asking for and helping the authors to fill out?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to only talk about a couple of the pieces of the spreadsheet that I actually use independently of the spreadsheet. I've been talking about some of the pieces, but I'll put the more proper editing terms on them now. So the first couple columns of the spreadsheet are things like, what is the page count? What number scene is this? So self-explanatory.
Now, why is the spreadsheet asking for that data?
Yes. So just to keep track of things, and really a lot of what you want. So a lot of writing a novel is really about balance. So you know that you need to do X, but you can't do X. You can't repeat. Well, you can repeat, but you're going to bore your readers if you repeat. So what the spreadsheet does is you put a whole bunch of information about your story down, and it makes it a lot easier to see where your story might be dragging, where you're repeating things. And repeating might happen in actual what's called the story event. So a story event is like the victim is killed. That's a story event. Another story event might be like somebody who has been injured and was unconscious regains consciousness. Another story event might be boy meets girl. So I kind of lost track about what question you were at, what I was answering.
Well, you were mentioning that the story grid is asking for what scene are you on, what's your word count, and I was trying to figure out why does the spreadsheet want this information?
Yes, yeah. So the word count isn't really important, except for I think the one thing to know about word count is usually the climax of your book tends to be the longest scene in the book.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, so why are we tracking word count in other parts of the book?
That is I think that one is, yeah, I don't really count it. I really only pay attention to it when there's something that it indicates a problem.
Okay. Like
So
100,000 words and you're only 25% in.
exactly. Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So we've got to the story event, and so then each scene, something is going to happen, and it's going to have, you're going to be able to describe, like, boy meets girl, or a lot of writers do things where they're like, this is the scene where I give you the backstory of, the protagonist. Well, so what really makes the story grid help is to identify scenes like that, because if the only purpose of your scene is to give the backstory of your character, that is not a scene, that is a bunch of backstory.
Right.
And so the next columns sort of help with that, and those are things about, like, what changes, like what really happens in this scene. So there's a really great scene from the first season of Mad Men. I think it's episode 2, and it's when one of the guys in the office gives Peggy Olson a tour of the office. Mm-hmm. And that is just completely filled with backstory about, like, this is how the advertising business works. But it's compelling because we know that the real reason that scene is there is because the guy wants to sleep with her. Uh-huh. And, like, what we're interested in is seeing, like, is he going to succeed? Is she going to reject him? And that's about, like, what's the life values that are shifting. So, in this scene, it's from acceptance to rejection.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, there's a spreadsheet. This sounds like just an incredibly detailed look at your story. So talk to me about, like, how a gardener or a pantster would kind of approach this. I mean, it seems like the story grid very much works with how a plotter approaches telling a story. But what about the pantsters and the gardeners?
Yeah. So we're talking about, like, the work that I do as an editor. And so let me talk about sort of how I work with writers.
Okay.
So when somebody comes to me with a manuscript, whether it's 40,000 words or more than 100, the first thing I do with them is we just write 3 sentences that are about their entire story. And it's called the story spine. And if you want to know more about it, I've written about it on my blog, and I learned about it from Stephen Pressfield's website.
Who's he?
He is a writer. He wrote The Legend of Bagger Vance. He wrote, there's a really famous war one about the Battle of Thermopylae that I can't remember. He's a writer. He's extremely successful writer now, and he has a blog about writing as well.
All right. So yeah, I was like, how come this is like, seems like Sean would have taught this to you.
Yes. Yeah. Well, Sean now does incorporate that into, because I actually had a client where I was like, I'm not sure what this story is about. And he was like, have you done the story spine and come up with 3 sentences about this story? And this was a while back, and we hadn't done that yet. And so now that is what I start with.
Okay.
And so I do, like, a lot of, I don't do spreadsheets for people until they get to, like, I did a very small spreadsheet for someone who just finished the first act of her book. And we're using that to go back and change. So, like, writers themselves don't have to, well, if they're working with me, they don't have to do it themselves. And so, like, they can still be intuitive, and I can just tell them, like, okay, you need to get from point A to point B. You can do that however you would like.
Yeah, that's interesting. So having the editor, even if they're a pantser or a gardener, having the editor, they still don't see all the architecture going on because the editor's doing that.
Yeah, and that really, like, I really try to train my writers to sort of get, I mean, really, when you're writing a lot, eventually this becomes kind of like muscle memory to you.
Yes.
Of like, oh, you get that. But what I do in working with writers, because I'm more towards the writing coach end of the spectrum, is I try and first, if they're really struggling and they don't have a story that's close, I'll direct them to get something that is close, and then I'll try to build on that so that we, by the time we're done, that they get to a point where they feel like they can write something that's, pretty decent on their own.
So, okay. So you just said something that I'm not really familiar with here. The writing coach end of the spectrum. I'm assuming you're talking about the editorial spectrum.
Yeah. Yes.
Talk to me about that, because this is the first time I've ever heard this phrase, and I'm not sure what either end of the spectrum means.
Yeah, so a lot of writers, the way that they work with editors is they write an entire manuscript. They turn that manuscript over to an editor who reads the entire manuscript and then, writes up a ton of notes and hands them their manuscript back.
Right.
So that's on the fairly standard editor side of things. I do something that's much more coaching oriented, where so people do come, they hand me their manuscripts, I read those manuscripts, and then together over the course of a couple of months, we work on their story and help, sort of both with the story that they're working on, and then also try and incorporate, here are the skills that you need to learn for this story and for every story that you write from here on out.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
So basically it's like the Story Grid podcast, except instead of Sean Coyne, you get me.
and it's your story.
And it's your story, not Tim Grohl's story.
Right. So is there anything more you want to cover in scene? Otherwise, I've got some kind of branched out questions. We've chased a lot of tangents already.
Yes,
but these are planned tangents. So.
Yeah, the one thing that I did want to say that I don't think I said before is that, so we talked a little bit about life value shifts, and that is what that's what forms the emotional bond between you and between your reader and your protagonist. And those life value shifts are things like life and death, love and hate, acceptance and rejection. And I've written about it a lot on my blog, and so you can read about it there. Actually, there's a new article on the Story Grid website about that, and I'll give you the links so that you can put them in the show notes. But the one thing that I want everybody to take away is that there is a life value shift that happens over your entire story, and there is a life value shift that happens in every single scene, and every set of scenes which form a sequence, and every set of sequences that form an act. And so in every unit of story, something changes, and in really well-crafted stories, those little shifts in scenes support larger shifts in sequences, and those sequences support larger shifts in acts, and those acts support larger shifts in the whole story.
Okay, great. All right, so I do have one question. Can you define or explain the fool's cap?
Yeah, so I actually don't really use the fool's cap. The fool's cap is a one-page outline of your story that Sean came up with.
Tim and him talk about it all the time. They're always talking about it, and I'm like, what is this thing? I don't know.
I use the concepts that are on the fool's cap, but I don't actually use the format of the fool's cap. So what's on the fool's cap it identifies your content genre. It identifies the inciting incident of your entire story, the progressive complications, the crisis, the climax, the resolution. And those things that I just mentioned are the 5 commandments of storytelling, which basically what creates those changes, those life value shifts, are the 5, when you obey the 5 commandments, you create scenes and sequences and acts and stories that have changes that satisfy readers. And the 5 commandments basically give you the rules about how to create that set of like creating tension and then releasing it.
So, okay, we don't have time to go in depth into all 5 commandments. Can you list them really quick for us? And then we'll put a link in the notes.
Yes. So the inciting incident, which is what upsets the balance of your protagonist's life. The progressive complications, which makes things more serious. The crisis, which is the one that most writers miss. And that is your character has to make a choice in every scene. The climax is what choice do they actually make? So the crisis is always in the form of a question. The climax is the answer to that question. And then the resolution is what
consequences of that.
What are the consequences? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, so like I said, I think you wrote an article, or at least you linked me to an article on this. The 5 commandments here.
Yes. Yeah, I have definitely written about the 5 commandments. There are multiple articles and podcast episodes on the StoryGrid site about the 5 commandments. If you Google 5 commandments, you will find information.
So, okay, so my last question here is not necessarily about writing craft, but more about publishing. And I'm curious to see what shifts you've seen. So I think 2008, we have the Kindle and the boom of indie publishing, and we start to see books like The Martian and Wool and 50 Shades of Grey being plucked from indie writers into traditional publishing. So what changes have you seen, and what do you see kind of happening within traditional publishing or editing as a result of this?
Yeah, well, I'm not really involved on that side of the spectrum, so that is not a question that I can really give an answer.
Oh, okay. So talk to me about your, like where do you fit in your editing work within all of publishing? Where's your cog fit?
Yeah, so I work with writers who most of them haven't they've written books, but they haven't, maybe they've self-published them, maybe they haven't, but they definitely they usually don't have agents, but maybe they might like to get one, or, they want to self-publish and they want to become, their dream is to become a full-time writer. But I am very early on in that process of like, okay, you've got a manuscript, you're going to need to do something, you need to learn things. A lot of my writers are like looking at other workshops and that kind of stuff. And I really help them get this first book into a shape where they're like, okay, like I would feel good about self-publishing this, or this is something that's in a shape where like, yeah, I can totally send this to this agent.
Okay, so you're kind of you're whatever publishing avenue they choose to go with, you're before that step.
Exactly.
So I guess my question is, how do you find clientele then?
Yes. Yeah. So I talk to people on podcasts, and I write blog posts, and I go to networking events, and, do all of the things that you would expect.
So, okay. All right. Well, is there, let's do a shout out. Tell us where they can find you and contact you and all of that.
Yeah, so you can find me at loripuma.com, and it's LORIPUMA.com. I've got a blog, I've got an email list, and if you join my email list, you'll get a thing that tells you a lot more about the 12 content genres and the story spine that I mentioned. I also do a free call with writers, so if you are working on a first draft and you can submit, I'll read up to 5,000 words of your work, and I will get on the phone with you and talk about like what's the one next step that you can take to improve this story.
All right. So those are the two avenues, not a Facebook or Twitter.
Oh no, I am on Twitter at Lori_Puma, and I'm on Facebook at Lori Puma page, and I'm also on Goodreads. And on Goodreads, I often, and my reviews don't tend to be reviews. I tend to write, like I identify important scenes and story events from the really good fiction that I read. So that can sometimes be a resource if you are like, I want to write a story that is like, Gone Girl. Well, I wrote, what happened in each of those scenes in that. So if you're like, I want to do like a hero, victim, villain switch like they did in there, that is a good.
Yeah, they do a switch in there. So, okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. As always, thanks for listening. You can find the podcast at joseph-bendosky.com and just in the start writing section there, or I think you can just do /start-writing. Our host site, Podbean, so you can find all the episodes there. I've made some changes, so hopefully within the next week or two, 80 episodes should be showing up in iTunes, and I think we only have 91. Well, I guess that doesn't count the vocab episodes. So I'm going to keep working with it and try and get all of the catalog available on iTunes. We would love it if you would tell your friends, and if there's a topic you're interested in or curious about, or even have been studying yourself and would just maybe want different opinions on it, go ahead and write in, and we'll get working on an episode on that topic.